come now to the last chapter of 1 Samuel, chapter 31. We'll study the first 6 verses today. The book was mainly about transitioning Israel from being ruled by God through a series of judges to being ruled by kings. It focused on giving the people the kind of king they wanted when they wanted him, rather than the king that God wanted for them at the time that God wanted to give a king to them. And so, to complete this rather difficult transitory phase of Israel's history, the book ends with the death of key figures. Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. The chapter starts off with a battle waging between the Israelites and the Philistines, and King Saul's army wasn't doing too well. Many were fleeing. Many others were slain on Mount Gilboa. At some point, the Philistines overtook Saul and his 3 sons, who apparently were also fleeing. They killed Jonathan, David's good friend. They killed Abinadab, and they killed Malchishua. And archers badly wounded their father, Saul. Saul recognized he was about to die, but his pride continued to motivate him. There was no way he was going to die at the hands of the Philistines. Instead, he asked his armor-bearer to pierce him with his sword. He did not want those uncircumcised Philistines, as he calls them, to finish the job and to make sport of him. The armor-bearer refused out of fear. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. Seeing his master dead, the armor-bearer did likewise, and he died. The Jews say that Saul's armor-bearer was Doeg. You will remember him as being the one who had killed the priests for helping David. You can look that up in 1 Samuel chapter 22. If that is the case, if this is Doeg, it is justly deserving having his violent dealings return on his own head. David had foretold concerning him that God would destroy him forever. In fact, Doeg, we believe, to be the subject of David's 52nd Psalm. Verse 6 of our chapter here, chapter 31, also says that all Saul's men died that day with him, and his sons and armor-bearer. We're going to stop there and go digging for scriptural gems. We must realize, as David Gusick reminds us, that tragically Saul's sons were affected in the judgment of God against their father Saul, and most notably that the brave and worthy Jonathan died as we might have expected him to die, that is, loyally fighting for his God, his country, and his father the king to the very end. What is the implication of that for us? Simply this: many fathers or parents, ourselves included, may have sinned greatly against God, went our own way, disobeyed, rebelled if you like. If this story is any example for us, our children may well be affected in that God's judgment may well involve them. But here's the thing. Saul had been warned about his death and the death of his sons the day before. He could have reacted very differently to his God, but he didn't. Saul never really sincerely and tangibly repented of his sin. He didn't change his ways. But we can. And while doing so may not always eliminate the natural consequences of our sin, we at least know that we have done what God expects of his children, and then we can leave ourselves and our children in the mercy of our Father. Gusick presents us with another significant aspect of the story with respect to the death of Saul's sons. This cleared the way, he says, for David to be king. Perhaps Jonathan would have ceded his right to the throne, but we cannot say the same with certainty for Abinadab and Malchishua. By allowing Jonathan's life to end, it is possible that God was saving him from a battle with his brothers on David's ascent to the throne, as he would have likely sided with David against his brother or brothers. Here's the point for us. We never know all the whys and wherefores of God's thinking in allowing certain things to happen. We need to remember that. It is something we must remember when we lose a loved one, especially one who dies at a young age or in an untimely death. As it was, David still had to deal with Ishbosheth, the one serving son of Saul, before taking the undisputed throne of Israel. We'll see that later in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 8 through to 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 12. One issue this passage raises is whether Saul committed suicide. And what about his armor bearer? Well, again, opinions are mixed on this matter. Much depends on one's definition of suicide. Some would argue that death was imminent for both, and thus they wanted to hasten it. Of course, that is the argument for euthanasia and assisted suicide today. Have we started our descent upon the slippery slope? Just this week, I read about a so-called Christian church in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Canada, that held its first service in the sanctuary for an assisted suicide. The aged woman who wanted to die was there and welcomed all visitors to come and say goodbye. Then she got injected by the drug that would kill her, and she died shortly afterwards in the church. I personally saw that as murder in the cathedral and wondered what was next for these liberal churches. Perhaps a service to celebrate an abortion. God forbid. Please share your thoughts on suicide and medical assistance in dying, especially as facilitated by the church. You can comment below on our YouTube channel. Returning to Saul for a moment, we see the end of a man that had great abilities coming to a place of rebellion against and failing to obey God. He rejects God as absolute ruler over him, and God rejects him as ruler over Israel. Finally, you would think that based on this account, Saul was dead. But the fact remains that we'll see when we get into 2 Samuel, he may not have been quite dead yet. I say may because there are two possibilities on that. But let's save that for later. Next time, we'll see how the Israelites react to Saul's death. Join us for what should be our last study in 1 Samuel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That encourages us. Send us a note on the comments. Share these videos with others. Keep on studying God's Word. Look us up on Facebook, Digging for Scriptural Gems. And then I want to remind you again that if you send me an email, my email address is at the end, ask for our free copy of a study that I just completed, Who Was Melchizedek? Somebody asked me to do that, and I had great joy in doing it. I'd love to share it with you and get your thought. Who was Melchizedek? Just email me at kgod@accordconsulting.com, and I will send you an absolutely free, no other obligation, copy of that document. Have a good one.